Okay, it's recording. Shall we like 3, 2, 1 it?
Yeah,
Okay, 3, 2, 1. Hi, Debbie. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's so nice to finally meet you. I've been following you online for quite some time, and I admire so much what you do, and I think your voice is so amazing.
Well, thank you.
How are you doing tonight? You're somewhere in the UK.
I am. I live in Birmingham, England. It's
Ah,
uh, it's around 11 p.m. here, so everybody else in the house has gone to bed. So it's a good time to talk to people on the east coast of the US and Canada.
perfect, perfect. So, just for anyone who's watching, if they don't know, this is Dr. Debbie Hayton, who has a doctorate in physics. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, atomic physics.
Atomic physics, amazing, and is a high school teacher in science at the moment. Is
Yeah,
that right?
yeah,
Yeah. And Debbie is a trans woman, came out and transitioned sometime in the last 10 years. Is that right?
yeah. I transitioned in 2012,
Okay.
so
Yeah. And
about 8
since
years ago.
then, yeah, you've been an advocate for trans rights this whole time, but you've also seen how the movement has changed and things have it seems to me, gotten a little bit out of hand. And you've been a voice of reason and a voice of balance throughout all of this. And it's been quite the journey for the last few years, hasn't it?
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. My campaigning doesn't meet with universal approval. Uh, I like to think that I'm campaigning for trans rights from a position of reality and a position of science, and to keep the focus on our right to do things and leaving these questions of identity to one side because I agree with others that our identities are not up for debate. So don't let's debate them. Let's debate what we're like, how we can interact with society, and how we can do things.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I find myself and so many of us who are finding ourselves increasingly critical of the tactics and the attitudes of the new gender identity movement. Like myself, I'm a gay man, so I'm a gay rights advocate. So I feel like the LGB and the T are very closely united. And I'm in a strange position that I'm very opposed to so much that's going on within T activism. So it's so refreshing to be able to talk to somebody who is themselves transsexual and to make sure that we're getting that balance right, that the things that I'm critical of the trans movement aren't harming trans people themselves. And vice versa, that we can agree on the things that the trans movement is doing that are perhaps going off the rails, or perhaps not benefiting trans people or gays and lesbians, or, of course, women and girls, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm in a position like so many people I know personally, they just don't understand that this issue is complicated. They just think anything critical of gender identity ideology is harmful to all trans people, and they don't understand that it's it's a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. And there haven't been enough voices speaking up to say that that's not necessarily true, which is why your voice has been so important. And adding to that, of course, that you happen to be an extraordinary writer and a very intelligent, analytical mind.
Yeah, you're too kind.
I'm just laying it on thick at the
Yeah,
beginning.
I think it's just picking up on one or two things you said there because you're right. We have so much in common from the lesbian, gay, and bisexual movement and the trans movement. We need to find common ground, and we need to find mutual. We need to find mutual support because it tends to be the same people in society that will have a go at us both. And if we can find areas where we can campaign together, then we're so much stronger. But I find this new gender identity ideology, as I started calling it, it's just deeply harmful. It moves away the focus from science and what makes us the people that we are, which is our bodies, for goodness sake, and into some metaphysical realm where we're trying to base rights on fantasy, and it's like it's like trying to build rights not on reason but on feelings, and that's just not getting us anywhere.
No, that's right. Now you have a very you obviously you're transsexual, but you're
Yeah,
also a scientist, so you're very much familiar with materialism and material reality. And you're also very good at questioning things and looking for evidence. And tell us a little bit about your journey, if you can. I know you've told it a lot of times in other interviews, but perhaps if somebody's listening who isn't familiar.
Okay, well, as I said, I gave my story to a psychiatrist in about 2020, the end of 2011, 2012, and he said that it was the classic transsexual narrative, in that I was uncomfortable with my body from a young age, managed to live with the situation, uh, cope, and move through life. And eventually, in midlife, things became too much. My mental health collapsed. I went for I looked for medical assistance, really, to say, what can I do with this? I transitioned in 2012, whatever that means. I thought at the time I was some sort of woman. That was the the narrative. The born in the wrong body. I did believe it, but you can never even justify that to yourself. Which is, it's no wonder why people get upset when other people deny it, because if I was never able to prove that to myself. So when other people said, "Well, what do you mean by this?" It really did make me feel anxious and very tense and liable to snap at them. So I understand where my political opponents now are coming from in that regard. But anyway,
Yeah.
I transitioned, and I had two aims. One was to keep my job, and secondly to keep out the press. Well, I still have the same job which I had in 2012. I still teach in the same school, and the kids are different. They've all gone through, but my job's the same. But I didn't manage part two, which was staying out of the press. I managed actually for about 4 years. I managed quite well, and I kept my head down and got on with life. And I found myself in a society which is very accepting of trans people, very tolerant of us, allows us to transition and get on with life, and says to us, well, you've got a contribution to make to society, get on with it and make your contribution, and all worked very well. But
Wow.
then came around 2016, and our government in London was discussing changes to the law, and one was this self-identification, which has been an issue around the world, in that allowing people to change their legal sex just by signing a piece of paper, which I thought was ludicrous. But more than that, we have in the UK a protected characteristic called gender reassignment, which is basically our right to do things, to change our bodies, to change the way we present in society, to actually do things. And there was a proposal to change it to gender identity, which is common in other jurisdictions. I know that, but nobody can actually define this nobody can actually define gender identity. So I felt we were going from some concrete reality to something which was metaphysical, and I worried about trans people's credibility, and I worried about upsetting their trust and confidence between people, which seemed to work very well. I thought, well, society is working very well for us. Why upset it? So I started writing. The first piece I wrote was on my blog, and I just said I didn't think this was a good idea, and it got quite a bit of interest in that piece. But then I just kept writing, and I just kept speaking, and when people didn't like it, and sometimes they don't, I've never been quelled by arguments along the lines of, what you're saying, Debbie, makes me feel uncomfortable, so don't say it.
Mm.
Because I then say, well, why? And people have no answer to that. If people could give me a reason why I was wrong, then I'm quite happy to change my mind. But I think reason and truth has to come above just become feelings. It just has to come above feelings.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because so when even though you have a strong science background, when all of your feelings of dysphoria came to a head, and it sounds like you started transitioning quite rapidly from that point.
Yeah.
You believed was it metaphysical almost, this idea that you were a woman trapped in a man's body, or was it just kind of undefined?
Well, it's undefined. That's the narrative. That's the story. Where women trapped in men's bodies is the story, and
Mhm.
it's a real there's a lot of allure behind that narrative,
Mhm.
because it says it's not our fault. This is some dreadful card we've been played by nature. Something's gone wrong. And needs to be put right, and we're not to blame
Mhm.
for it. It's not our fault. So it has, it's very attractive. Is that narrative? But the problem with it is when people say, "Well, what does this mean to be a woman trapped in a man's body?" And you can't. You can't answer. You can't give reasons for it. And as a scientist, I found that deeply unsatisfactory. So I would get annoyed with people, and I would get upset with people, and tell them that they were denying who I was by asking these questions, because
Mm.
I couldn't answer them.
So you were kind of not really ready to ask them to yourself yet, so you were getting very upset that people were asking them of you. Is that right?
Yeah, and it was, and at the time, I was unable to explain to myself why I actually felt like how I did. I knew there was a huge mental dissonance between my body as it was and how I wanted to see my body and how I prefer it to be. It was massive, but I couldn't
Mhm.
I couldn't explain it. And this very simplistic idea of being born in the wrong body explained it all away. It didn't never explained it, but it explained it all away. And as long as you could accept that,
Mhm.
uh, everything was fine. But firstly, I couldn't really, and secondly, you could never believe that everybody else thought it as well. So your life was based on an illusion.
The very fragile sort of, yeah,
Yeah,
maintaining this sort of this falsehood, and there
yeah,
are so many repercussions for everyone. With if you take the more and more literally you take this sort of palliative belief, the more if you think people can really be trapped in wrong bodies, you could apply this to babies, as we see people doing now. Declaring that babies who take the barrettes out of their hair, that's a sign that they
yeah,
need intervention and that kind of thing. But eventually, you've come to understand that your condition is very real and very significant, of course. No one's denying that. But you understand it in a much more scientific light. And I think you ascribe pretty closely to the Blanchard model. Is that right? That autogynephilia is a thing that drives perhaps a lot of people's desire to transition. Is that right?
yeah. Yeah, something's got to drive this. The need to transition was absolutely overwhelming back in 2011, 2012. And something was driving this, and the drivers on us as human beings and as male human beings, the male sex drive is just huge.
Absolutely.
And what Blanchard has suggested, and others before him, it's not just Blanchard's own idea,
Hmm.
was that it's driven by the male sex drive, in that for most males, we're female attracted. It's unusual for males to be male attracted. You're the unusual one, I guess.
It's right. Less than 2%. Yeah.
So for most of us, possibly 98%, were female attracted. Now, in most cases, and in my case as well, to some extent, I'm deeply attracted to my wife and her body, but that locus of sexual attraction is not just or not only on other people's bodies, so to be looking at other people's bodies, but reflected onto our own. So it's an error of that target location. So it then becomes on our own bodies. So in very simplistic terms, you're sexually attracted to your own body, but you're sexually attracted to female bodies, but you've got a male body, and this just causes so much cognitive dissonance, and you can't admit at the time this is huge, but you can't even admit it to yourself, because the idea, I don't know about I don't know about you, Artie, but in Britain, the idea of being the idea of being attracted to your own body is just deeply shameful. And so that you've got aspects of shame and fear of this being uh, fear of this being discovered, just tells you to bottle it up. So you've got these huge pressures, but no way of actually releasing those pressures. And I guess, for the first 4 years I was transitioned, I just kept a lid on it. There was too much else to do. I live a busy life, and got on with life.
Yeah, so
Even
the idea
sorry,
of being a woman trapped in a man's body then is just a simple way to not have to deal with that all at once, perhaps. All of that, is
yeah,
that right?
it explains it away.
Yeah. Well, it's such a two thing. First of all, I want to say it's so refreshing to be able to talk with you about this because sometimes there's so much fear of saying the wrong thing or of offending someone. And of course, if I say anything to offend you, say so. But I feel like there's just so much ease that there are questions that people have that they're afraid to ask to trans people. And you just seem like someone that just puts people at ease and you can ask these very frank questions as long as they're polite and civil, of course. And you're not going to take offense and, push back. And that's just so refreshing. We really need to open that up and talk about this stuff openly. But also to your point about explaining the idea of being sexually attracted to your own body, I did an interview with a gay man named Duncan, who's from Sheffield recently. And he made a really interesting point that gay people, he's very new to this whole thing, and he's just come around to realizing that he's critical of some aspects of gender identity ideology. But when he discovered the Blanchard typology and the idea of autogynephilia, of being sexually attracted, sort of being an erotic target location applying to one's own body, he's like, well, I'm a gay man. I understand this completely. Every time I look in the mirror, I'm sexually attracted to myself. I go to the gym because I'm sexually attracted to my own body. And when I'm thinking about sex, I'm thinking about my own body just as much as other people's. So I wonder if actually gay men have a very keen understanding of the concept of being sexually attracted to a member of a certain sex, males, but also seeing that on themselves and being very much comforted and by those feelings. It's not so alien to some of us, perhaps, was his suggestion, and I thought, yeah, autogynephilia is. I kind of believe that if more, what do you think of this? That if it was more widespread and openly discussed among people who are just dealing with dysphoria, do you think that would ease their mental health, perhaps? If we
Well,
approach.
it certainly helped mine because you end up basing your life and basing a transition on something that makes sense,
Yeah.
and doesn't require the validation of anybody else.
Mhm.
It's quite simply that it's a sexual attraction to your own body, and because I'm heterosexual, I guess there's a mismatch there. And it explains why gender transition can be it's been described. Blanchard's described it as a palliative. It provides a palliative solution. It doesn't solve any problems, and it sometimes can create a lot more. But it does relieve the dissonance, the dysphoria. But I think if we were just able to talk about this without the shame that goes with it, then I think people would be a lot, people would be a lot happier in themselves, and possibly with improved mental health. But the problem is, and again, I go back to what I was saying about with the born in the wrong body. That's not our fault. This very much is. This is down to us, and this is a conscious decision that we're taking to transition, in that to make our bodies, to make ourselves more comfortable with our bodies, is a really selfish thing to do in a and has such an impact on other people around us, and that involves taking responsibility, and that's hard.
I think I made a video called "Trans is something you do, not something you are." I don't know if you saw that, but yeah, exactly. But it has to be destigmatized. I've always said this, that the more we destigmatize the concept of autogynephilia, the more it would make things so much better for everyone. Like yeah, there just seem to be a lot of problems with the trans activist movement getting more and more metaphysical, where they're literally saying that sex doesn't exist now. They're literally saying like a penis is really a misshapen vagina, or a vagina of a different shape, and all of these things. That can't be healthy. And we can't sustain this. This movement is really, it's strange because it's really got everyone's on board with these kinds of statements. Nobody's pushing back on them because everyone's afraid. I'm just constantly being contacted now by people who are getting fired from their jobs for saying the most mildest things. Yeah, it, yeah. To me, I think I've been hearing you talking about what is real trans activism, like what is advocacy to help trans people. Definitely, legislation to make sure people are secure in their jobs. Number one, first and foremost, you know, you need your job if you want to transition, and you need to be secure in your job. Um, and, security in your housing, making sure there's security in, if you're trapped in the sex trade, you have to get out of that kind of thing. But I think a huge one is mental health. Don't you agree that there should be so much more mental health resources for trans people?
Yeah, and that's what comes first in order to try and help people understand themselves. But mental health services are expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, hormones are cheap. You can buy a packet of hormone pills for next to nothing, whereas the psychotherapy that people need in order to be able to unlock the issues inside them, so they understand themselves, that involves people and that costs money. And to be trying to be calling for improved mental health, increased mental health services. First of all, you're campaigning for something that's going to cost the country money, so it's not popular with the authorities. And then secondly, and this is the I'm told this, that people say they don't need any mental health services because they don't have any mental health issues, and then proceed to exhibit them. It's just there's a dissonance there. It just doesn't add up.
Yeah. What do you think about the phenomenon of trans kids, so to speak? That seems to be very new. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it comes back to what we're saying about this idea of gender identity, that people have a gender identity. I don't think we do. I don't think it exists. I think it was a lazy description to try and just describe symptoms with gender identity. But it's become a thing, and that we all have this gender identity, and as soon as we find it out, then we'll find true peace and contentment in living according to that gender identity. So that's what's having the impact on kids, rather than just saying, these children are gender non-conforming. And there's always been children who have really, really struggled from an early age with their sex bodies, and some will go on in adulthood to transition. But never before have we actually picked children out before puberty and said, you perhaps in the wrong body, or led them to believe that they're in the wrong body themselves. And children too young to get a tattoo because it's a permanent mark on the body. Even buy a pack of cigarettes. They're just not allowed to do that because of the long-term impact on their health. Yet we're allowed these children to make decisions at such a young age to take treatment which disrupts their natural development through adolescence. And I just think this is, how did we get here to be able to do this? I just can't believe it. I had for example, I had a vasectomy when I was 34. And I remember having to explain why I needed this. And I said, I'm 34, I've had 3 kids, I don't want any more. But, if a 16-year-old boy turned up asking for a vasectomy because he didn't want any children, he'd be sent straight out the door. Yet we're allowing younger children than that to effectively do the same thing, which is to cut off, for all time, their ability to have their own children before they know what it means to be an adult. And people think this is a good idea. It is so irresponsible.
They're celebrating it even. They see it as affirming someone's gender identity. I'm still hearing stories. I have well, it's my ex-boyfriend and I got together recently, and he said he has some new friends. One of them has, a very young male child who is being affirmed as a girl. And I was like, and he's like, oh, we just have to be polite about it. He doesn't really agree that that's a healthy thing to do, but he just goes along with it because it's what you do in your white middle class social circles. That child is going to be harmed. I think, and I'm interested to talking to you about this. I know a lot about sort of homosexual childhood dysphoria because I myself was very effeminate as a little boy, and I had some degree of that. But I don't know anything about what it's like to grow up as a child on the other side, as a heterosexual male who experiences autogynephilia and has had symptoms of that from an early age. Is it different, do you think?
Well, we can never get into each other's heads to actually
No.
check. That's the
Yeah.
problem. I was never particularly feminine as a boy. My interests were typically masculine
Mm-hmm.
in all respects. I desperately wanted to be a girl without being able to explain to myself why that was, and that came from preschool. I remember, from places where I lived and thoughts going through my head in houses where I was living. It came from preschool. So I think the causes of that is different. We talk about dysphoria, just a dissatisfaction with life, and gender dysphoria, which is tied into gender,
Mm-hmm.
but. Gender identity it just smothers all that, rather than saying there's probably lots of different causes why people feel dissatisfied with their bodies. We then just invent this term called gender identity, and then that just takes all the nuance out of the investigation, out of
Everything.
just helping people. And then it's just really wrong how young children, boys can be masculine or feminine. A really progressive solution would be to say the feminine boy can express himself as feminine as he actually likes, but then we don't accept that because adults sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable with feminine boys.
Yeah, but
So
it's the adults.
maybe it will make the adults around him a lot more comfortable if they convince themselves he's a girl, and then convince the child he's a girl. And what that does to children growing up at that age, heaven only knows, because we've not been through this.
Yeah,
I
but of course
describe
the
it as
children are happy
uncontrolled
in the short
experiment.
run. I want to just emphasize, yeah, so the parents are uncomfortable with the feminine boy. The parents are telling the boy that the boy is really a girl. And the boy is actually happy with that in the short run because they're like, sure, that means I'm not going to get dirty looks for playing with dolls. I'm not going to get dirty looks for wanting to, whatever, do girly things, whatever those may be. So, I mean, yeah, like, sorry, go on. I just wanted to emphasize that the kid isn't going to be upset in the short run. They're going to be happy and go along with it. But that doesn't mean they're really happy with it for the rest of their lives. Yeah.
Yeah, it's what happens. It's fine for a 5, 6, 7-year-old boy to be to grow his hair out and to wear dresses. Absolutely fine. But it's what happens when you get to puberty.
Mm-hmm.
That's the issue, because an 8-year-old child can pass as either sex, I guess. But as you go through puberty, it becomes more difficult, and decisions then have to be made. Do you effectively desist and return to your normal gender, the gender role attached to your sex, or do you then go on the treadmill of medication, and then that's the question, and the decision then taken by children themselves, and that I think is putting them in an absolutely impossible position.
And often they're not even making the choice. It's not even the children being too young to make the choice. They're not making the choice. I was just speaking to a father whose daughter was going through a really hard time around the age of 11. And her school counselor was really pushing her into transitioning to the point that eventually, when this girl agreed that she's really a boy, she didn't pick a name. The school assigned her a boy's name. And I just thought that's the most shocking thing I've ever heard in my life, that a school counselor would take this child and reassign them a boy's name and tell that child that they're really trans. That just seems like a whole new level. We're not just letting these kids make the decisions and going along with them. We're very explicitly making them for them, in the direction of medical transition. Like, yeah, that one really floored me.
Yeah, sounds like a project for the adult rather than a solution for the child.
No, yeah, exactly. Exactly. So did your dysphoria fluctuate over time? Did your feelings and your anxiety issues, did they change over
Yeah, it came and went. It never went away. Sometimes, I guess it was always there. Sometimes I would notice it more than others. Keeping myself very busy, clear goals and targets in life away from the dysphoria. I'm an introverted person, but if I've got clear goals to work on, I can fix on those. I got married. Marrying was a good way of putting it to one side because I had a different focus there. But it waxed and waned, never went away, but never became overwhelming. The situation did become overwhelming around 2010, 2011, about 10 years ago. And it became overwhelming for two reasons. One, I became aware that the treatment was possible. That treatment for this was possible. Medically assisted gender transition wasn't just something that you read about in fairy tales. I was coming across people online who had done this, and people who had quelled their gender dysphoria, and that was tempting to do that yourself. The very availability of the treatment then started driving the need for it. And then secondly, it was talking to other people in the same situation, and you do get a focus on the transsexualism because that's what you share in common. So for me, I guess it was what flipped it from being a chronic condition I was living with to an acute gender dysphoria that I found totally overwhelming and nearly destroyed me was knowledge of the availability of treatment. And that is what worries. Going back to the kids, that's what worries me there. In that, I coped throughout childhood. It was bits of my childhood were unpleasant, and I struggled with it in a lot of ways. But all children do. But I worry about children being presented with this, with the availability of treatment, and for them it does become overwhelming. And I'm just so glad that it didn't happen to me to that age, because I would have been in their position of making decisions about my future before I was an adult, and I would have never gone on to have my children. And that I think would have been I would have just lost so much, and that really does affect my whole position on this.
Hugely. So many of these children, they're male and female children. Yeah, they're going to be infertile. They're going to be sterile. They're not going to be able to have children. And to some degree, they're not going to be able to experience sexual pleasure as well. It's uncomfortable to talk about children growing up to later be able to have, a healthy sex life. But that's something we really have to talk about with these kids. And what else are we doing? Why are you giving a child, a vaginoplasty if not for that? Obviously, it's for their sense of, being able to look in the mirror and feel comfortable. But they're trying to fashion something that is functional sexually, right? But these kids who go on puberty blockers, their ability to experience a lot of sensation is going to be greatly diminished, is what I've heard.
Yeah, the techniques for the gender reassignment surgery techniques, have been worked on adults for 2 generations, so that's well known. And to put it bluntly, it's through puberty you develop the spare parts that are needed to move things around.
Okay.
And for the kids who are going, who never go through their natural puberty, never develop the material, never develop the tissue that's needed for this. So the techniques which are used are not as satisfactory. the story of Jazz Jennings, I guess, is the most well known, and probably we can talk about it because their family has been so open about it and about the issues which Jazz went through.
Yeah, it's so strange. Again, another one of these side effects of this overly enthusiastic affirmation of children as trans is leading to less successful transition, it seems, which is like, that's another reason, like, that it's not, I thought the whole point of early transition was more successful transition. And it seems like the exact opposite is the outcome in some ways, So that's just strange and at cross purposes. Yeah, adolescent and childhood transition are two issues that are really interesting to me. And it's interesting that you mentioned that your dysphoria really kicked in once you saw the availability of treatment. That reminds me of several things. One is that I've always wondered why this is a phenomenon that seems very much in the West and not in other parts of the world. There are some countries where like almost nobody has sort of autogynephilic transition, and other countries where many people do. And I've always wondered why, and maybe that's why. It's just exposure to the possibility that that's an option. Oh no, I've lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Oh yeah, there's another thing I read about how like maybe that's why so many young people are identifying as trans now. There's a therapist named Sasha Ayad. Are you familiar with Sasha Ayad?
No.
Oh, she's a really interesting therapist. And she wrote an essay, I think it was Sasha Ayad, comparing what it must have been like to be a female who feels deep gender dysphoria in the 1980s and has to come to the conclusion on her own, or their own, on his own eventually, that they want to transition and that they want to be a trans man when there's there's nothing in the media about it. That's a very difficult journey to make. And it's very rare for someone to come to that conclusion, right? You have to come to it completely on your own. Whereas now, all of these young people are inundated with, the internet is like, it's like the main drag in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Strip with just neon signs saying trans, trans, trans everywhere, and they're all walking down the street and they're all just being beckoned into all these trans casinos, so it's a lot easier for people to come to the conclusion that they must have gender dysphoria and they must be trans, because there's so much outside influence. And the other thing she said is that a lot of these young people, first they decide that they're trans, and then they develop severe dysphoria. It's first they decide this is a thing they are and they want to associate with, and then that's when they fixate on it, they ruminate on it, they think about it, they get completely immersed in it, and that's when the dysphoria kicks in.
Yeah, I've heard that it's changed completely from not being that trans arises from dysphoria, but the dysphoria arises from trans identification.
Yeah, isn't that strange? Yeah, there's this strange balance between how it's presented in society, and I don't see the psychology and psychiatry doesn't seem to be addressing that properly, it seems. It's almost like there's an underground network of psychologists and psychiatrists who are willing to, be skeptical and not immediately affirm.
Yeah, but it's difficult for them. I don't know what the situation in Canada is, but in the UK, therapists are expected to affirm. If a patient comes in and says, "I think I must be trans. I think I'm trans," the therapist it's not the therapist's job to challenge them on their thinking, which is just crazy. In every other aspect, the therapist is there to try and encourage the person to challenge their own thinking, to understand themselves. I fortunately, the therapy which I did have some therapy when I transitioned, and it was before this happened. And my therapist was, in some aspects, she was brutal. She, I remember I came in and said, I'm trans and I need to transition effectively, although it probably took me 2 hours to actually get to that point, but that's what I said. And she said, she came with a chair and she said, right, okay. And I guess she'd done this before. She got an open doorway and got a chair and said, right, we're going to put that chair in that open doorway. Through there is the word to transition. And what we're going to do is we're going to explore all the other options first before we move that chair. And so we were looking at basically living with it, some, ignoring it, the cold shower, the grit your teeth and the cold showers approach, all sorts of things. And I hated it. It felt it went on for months, but I think it was about 3 weeks. And we were looking at the other approaches. And I remember at one point, actually, probably about 3 weeks on, this probably didn't go on for as long as I remember it now, actually getting out of my chair and picking, I said, I've had enough of this. And then picking the chair up, which is in the doorway, and moving it. And she said, right, well, now look at transition. And it was later she said that she was never, ever going to move that chair. The only person who was going to move that chair from the door was me.
Wow.
And I look back at that now, and when I got up out of that chair to move that, out of my chair to actually move that chair from the doorway, I needed to do that. And I can still feel how necessary and important that was for me to actually have to do that. Whereas now, yeah, I transitioned. I'm at peace with myself. The dysphoria is gone. I don't suffer any dysphoria. And if it hadn't been for those memories, I'd be here thinking, did I really need to do that? And did I really need to transition? Because as I said, if it hadn't been for the memories of that chair in that doorway, I'd be thinking, no, maybe I didn't need to do that. Did I put my family and all my colleagues and all my friends through all this and make all these changes to my body, which were unnecessary? And I can't help but think as well, if I'd come through now and my therapist had just said, yeah, sure, you're trans, let's just discuss the mechanics on how you can go about this, I'd now be thinking, did I really need to do that? So I think all those, the affirmation therapy is letting down so many people, including those for whom transition is actually right. We do need to be challenged, and we need to take responsibility for our transitions as well. As I said, it was me who actually got up and actually moved that chair.
Oh, that's an extraordinary story. And I wonder, I can imagine a lot of trans activists hearing that story and saying, it's resonating how much it hurt and how much it really hurt for you to go through that. You said it felt like months when it may have only been weeks, but it was necessary. It was painful. There was an element of tough love. And these days people are just like, no, it's a discomfort. Even the Gender Recognition Act, that you have to go through some kind of certification process in order to have your to gain a gender recognition certificate. People are like, no certification, no process. This is all bad. This is all gatekeeping. Some of that is necessary. Some of that is necessary, like in this case, for your own good, for your own mental health, to make sure you know that this is what you need, and to help you make sure before you embark on this process that you're confident and you're secure and that this is the right decision for you. But of course, it's also about other people. Gatekeeping is about women and children's protections too, right? As I say, it's like you're applying for citizenship in a new biological domain. And, Americans can't just march into Canada and say, well, I feel Canadian, so fuck you. Canadians get to decide how to become a Canadian. Women get to decide how to become a woman. You're applying for citizenship in their domain. It's the way I've always kind of put it. But yeah, these days it's just no gatekeeping, no rules, self-ID all the way, which I find terrifying for their own health. I don't think it's healthy for people to be, everybody needs some degree of therapy before they embark on something this severe. And of course, I don't think it's healthy for women and girls and for gays and lesbians either,
Yeah, it has to be the gender recognition, which I usually describe as changing your legal sex. It's not your biological sex, but your legal sex.
Yeah.
It's a two-way contract with society, is that. It's you and your relationship with society. And to make that a unilateral decision just seems to me to be absolutely wrong. But there again, I've never although I've been through a medical transition, I've never done that legal transition. So I guess I've never applied for citizenship, and permanent residency, I guess, is the is what it would be the analogy. Though I think I'm not sure how good it is, but I've never invoked that legislation.
Yeah, which touches on some interesting. So, the idea that it's a two-way street. There seems to have been some very wonderful connections between trans women and feminists, and women in general. There seems to have been some nice bonds being formed that are. It seemed to be a lot of bonds are being broken now because of this aggressive new movement. I'm seeing a lot of, I see a lot of people who, become very much on the gender critical side of this debate, quote unquote. Um, a lot of people who are critical of, radical trans activism. But sometimes it's starting to tip over more and more into genuinely hostile rhetoric towards all trans women and trans men, and that seems to be such a shame. That all this really healthy bond is starting to fall apart. I've seen people say things that like anyone with autogynephilia is bad, and that autogynephilia is inherently misogynistic. To which I would reply, well, it's just heterosexuality, but inverted. It's like saying heterosexuality is misogynistic. I don't think that's true. Yeah. So do you see that too? That things are just sort of becoming harder for trans women and women to have a sort of rapport together.
The debate has just become so polarized, and I mentioned before this is what I saw happening 4 years ago, and the reason I got involved in the debate, the reason I did get myself, get myself known and blow my cover as a trans person of Indian society was just seeing this happening. Traditionally, women, this is women's territory. These are women's spaces. Women have, for what, for good or for whatever, have invited trans women in, but it's on women's terms. What was beginning to happen was it was then trans women saying, look, this is not an invitation. This is a right.
Mhm.
And if you're not going to invite us, we're coming anyway. And I could see this happening, this sense of entitlement that trans women were actually exhibiting, which just seemed to me to be an unwise strategy, because people are going to object to this, and they have objected, and they're right to object. If in doubt, you're cautious, and women find it difficult to tell the difference between. You mentioned about all autogynephiles are bad. Well, some are good, and some are bad, and women find it difficult to tell the difference between the good ones and the bad ones. In the same way, I guess it's about men. That it's difficult. Abusive men are very good at hiding the fact that they're abusive. They don't carry signs around saying I'm an abusive man. And so this sense of entitlement I just had deep sense of foreboding about. And I have every sympathy for women who just decide enough is enough. We were sympathetic. We invited you, and you've taken liberties. You've come in with a sense of entitlement, and now you can sling your hook and go. And I've got a lot. I can sympathise with that.
Yeah, and I can't help but wonder again if this at root is the treatment of dysphoria is not being treated properly. If these males with autogynephilia were if we're more clearly understanding what their condition was, and if we had worked harder to eliminate any of the stigma around autogynephilia, there wouldn't be this entitlement. They would recognize that they're not really, they're not genuinely women. First of all,
You get into trouble for that.
yeah, right. You know what I mean? But
yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just kind of feel like if only real trans activists, we could wind back the clock 20 years and then move forward with trans advocacy and trans activism. An ideal trans activism to me would have been going all in on destigmatizing autogynephilia and really taking the very scientific route about what it is and helping people to understand that. And wouldn't the world be somehow a better place? Because like my friend Duncan pointed out, it's really not that hard for people to understand autogynephilia. And it's not that scary at all. Gays get it like that, and if you call it just inverted heterosexuality, it seems quite pleasant,
Yeah. It shouldn't be a stigma, but these prejudices and shames run very deep in us as individuals, and it was I've described in the past as as being, my experience through childhood and early adulthood was being uncomfortable with the expectations society placed on me. But really, it was the expectations I was placing on myself.
I can relate
As
to that 100% as a gay man. I think
yeah,
no matter how much society accepts gays, it's still going to be a real struggle to come to terms with oneself as a gay man, because you still have to realize that you're not. There's still ideas that gay men aren't typically masculine, even though gay men are accepted, and there's still a lot of and that they're not going to be able to have traditional families, or it's going to be much harder for them to do so, to have children and things like that. Um, yeah, so like it doesn't matter how much societal acceptance there is, there's still going to be an internal struggle to some degree with one's own acceptance. And that doesn't that sound like it parallels uh, trans and gender dysphoria, that even if we did destigmatize AGP entirely, it would still be a real struggle within oneself to come to terms with applying that label to oneself, perhaps?
it
Yeah.
would be. Yeah, I think it does need to be destigmatized, and I do appreciate what all the work that Ray Blanchard has done. He has such a bad name, and he's criticized, but bizarrely it was Ray Blanchard who decided that transition was there to improve people's lives, and it can improve the life of a autogynephilic male in the same way that it can improve the life of a homosexual male. If the treatment improves somebody's lives, the treatment is appropriate. Whereas before then, the stories of people in the 60s and 70s, heterosexuals who were heterosexual males looking for transition, then had to pretend to be gay, of course. Whereas we don't have to do that now, and that's come from the work of people like Blanchard, who have said that gender transition is there not as a magic, so as a response to gender identity as such, but there to improve people's lives. And if it improves people's lives, then it's an appropriate treatment.
Yeah, and I've heard many times now people telling their anecdote of like transitioning later in life and being very angry and distressed, and eventually coming across Blanchard, and at first being hesitant to accept it, and then coming to suddenly see that their feelings are rooted in autogynephilia, and how much it's really helped them, and how that really helped them find wholeness again. And I also, we look back at in the 90s when people weren't so much transgender as they were TV or TS, transvestites or transsexuals. And, the transvestites were kind of a spectrum, it seems. There were some people who, as they progressed in their transvestic pursuits, they wanted maybe a touch of hormones, but they didn't necessarily want to live full time as women. Or many, of course, wanted to retain their genitals. They didn't want to have bottom surgery, so to speak. Some perhaps wanted breast augmentation. So it wasn't as simple as like some people just dress, some people go all in on the surgeries. There was a whole smorgasbord of people who had a lot in common. And it was Blanchard who really put it all together and said, this is all the same phenomenon, it's just different degrees. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it was the old joke. It was, what's the difference between a transvestite and a transsexual? And the answer was about 5 years. And it summed up that it was a journey for a lot of people, and it was that target location error of the of your sexuality on your own body. Well, the clothing can work, but deep down it is your body, and everything else is just it's just clothes are just clothes, aren't they, at the end of the day? We're sexually attracted to bodies.
Yeah. Do you think the whole the shift from transsexualism and transvestism to transgender, do you think it's partly to do with stigma? In that, I think the word transsexual has been destigmatized or at least it was work to that effect for some time. But transvestites were never really getting destigmatized, perhaps.
No, it wasn't. Going back again, 20 years ago, I guess transsexuals were pitied, as this poor person who is born, whereas the transvestites were just ridiculed. They were too often objects of ridicule. So the pity and the ridicule was replaced by, I guess, with the transgender person is celebrated. So
Right.
how we react, but people are the
It's
same.
borrowing whole cloth from the gay rights uh, playbook, I guess. We saw the gay pride and celebrate this thing that was vilified, and then transgender became that. All the pixie dust of gay and lesbian rights seemed to have been, you know. Sorry, go on. I cut you off. I didn't mean to.
No, I think it's interesting how things have changed, but people are the same. It's not that the transsexuals and transvestites have disappeared and transgender people have appeared. These are just different labels. Human beings are human beings, and
So many
human
activists don't know that, though. So many activists get so mad at that the idea that a transvestite is in the transgender umbrella. They're like, no, these are people with women's souls. They've got lady souls. And I want to think of who's the most famous transvestite? Eddie Izzard, right? That famous comedian who I saw Eddie Izzard live way back in the 90s when he came to Toronto. Loved Eddie Izzard. But now Eddie Izzard identifies as a woman. Isn't that right? Since the new movie came along, Eddie Izzard went from, these aren't women's clothes, they're my clothes. I bought them, which was such a revolutionary line to no, I've been a woman all along. And I feel like, oh, man.
Yeah, I think it's people are people, and human patterns of behavior are human patterns of behavior, and not much changes. Although we put different labels on things.
Yeah. Well, you've been doing, to go back to you and your story, in the last year, you've been putting out a lot of writing. You've been writing for, you put out pieces in The Spectator, The Economist. Well, maybe that was a year or two ago. I think The Times as well.
Yeah.
And other places. You've really been speaking up a lot. How has that felt for you? Have you felt like this is something you need to do or something you're happy to do? Yeah.
I enjoy writing. I can put together arguments to try and make a case, and I guess I do. I do like trying to persuade people, and the opportunities have come along, and I've taken them. The break, because I was putting pieces out of my blog, but I'm a trade unionist, and I sit on trade union committees, and I started writing pieces for the one of the left-wing papers in the UK, the Morning Star, and that came through my trade union links, and then it was writing pieces there that were noticed by journalists in other publications. And I'm quite, I will say to people, I'll write, I'm quite happy to write for publications across the political spectrum. I find it an interesting challenge to try and make my arguments relevant to the readership. And it's not that I never want to just write for a narrow audience. My own political leanings are on the left, but I can make the same arguments, and it's a challenge to make the same arguments for an audience on the right, perhaps a socially conservative audience or a socially liberal audience. So I'm quite happy to write for different publications and see what see what comes back. But all the time, I'm there to make arguments and try and persuade people. If people don't want to be persuaded, then so be it. I'm quite happy to go for a beer with them afterwards, whether whether they agree with me or not. What I find difficult is the emotional side of this, when by making an argument, for example, that trans women are not women because trans women are male and women are female, and male and female are not the same thing. I get accused of being a bigot, a transphobe, all those emotional terms of abuse. And I'm thinking, well, I'm just here to try and persuade somebody. If you're not going to be persuaded, then fine. But that I find difficult. Well, no, I don't find difficult. I find interesting, and just thinking, how have we got here? We've moved from a situation when people tried through reason to try and persuade somebody, to try and through emotion and trying to and it's not persuasion anymore. It's compelling people to think things through the power of emotion, and that I've got no time for that. And So I will carry on writing in order to try and persuade. But I keep thinking I must by now have written every last piece that's possible to write on the transgender debate. I think
Famous first
every
words.
yeah, and every time, so every time there is more,
Of
and
course.
something else happens, and I'll write about more. But I don't know how many. Most of my pieces are around 600, 700 words is my favorite length. Some pieces are longer, some pieces are shorter. But every single piece I've published, I've archived to my blog, and there's about 95 pieces there.
Wow.
Uh,
Wow.
some are translations because some people have been kind enough to translate my work, and then I'll put a copy of that on there. But it's it's tens of thousands of words I've written on this. I'm thinking, can there be any more? But there always is more because something will happen. One of my political opponents will do something that I consider to be irrational, and suddenly there's more to write about.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a lot more. I think it's going to be quite a while. Although the tide is turning. It definitely feel. I mean, just today, I don't want to date this video. I want it to be time immemorial. But yeah, today, as we recorded this, the government in the United Kingdom made some decisions that self ID was going to be scrapped. So that's exciting.
That is incredible. I came into this debate publicly when the government started talking about it in 2016, and it seemed like a done deal.
Mm-hmm.
I remember having lunch with another transsexual who's not in this debate at all. She's stealth in society, and we lunch and said, they can't mean this. Surely they can't mean it. It's insane to actually think that people can choose their own sex and this will be fine. And I remember having that conversation then, and it just seemed that how can we actually stop this across the world? The infamous now Yogi Carter principles were determined, and that they took those to the UN and other non-governmental organisations and international bodies, and one by one, legislatures across the world just seem to fall over to this like dominoes. In Canada, what on earth you have done with your legislation in Canada is just beyond belief. But it just seemed that it was irresistible. There was no way of stopping it. But in England, we paused it. The government consulted on this 2 years ago, and they've been sat on a consultation response now for 2 years, promising a response from this. And it seems that we've actually stopped it, and that's incredible, and it's a very loose alliance of campaign organizations and no public money behind any of this. It's all been done by people tweeting in their spare time and organizing on a weekend to try and just change, to change government policy. And it seems that we've done this. The official announcement hasn't yet been made. They promised, and this is notable. Earlier on in the summer, the government promised that this would happen in the summer, and I guess the very last day of summer that you could possibly stretch to is the equinox. Is the fall equinox, which is Tuesday. So we'll wait and see. The plans would clearly been leaked by somebody to the press over the weekend. So
I think a little birdie told me that it will be Wednesday when it's announced.
Right. Well, we'll see. We'll see. It depends. I guess where we are. We can be Wednesday here while it's still Tuesday in Canada, I guess. But they said the summer, so we'll see. But it really is quite incredible that people have done that. But then it's the rest of the world is watching what's happening in England and Wales.
Yeah, that's right. You're the first one.
Yeah, this has stopped. Scotland is a devolved nation, which sets its own laws in a lot of areas, and on gender recognition. That's what we call a devolved matter. Mm-hmm. So the Scots can decide that for themselves. They paused it because of all the COVID, the response to COVID, they decided they couldn't progress the legislation while this was going on. But they will need to pick up on this now and decide what they're actually going to do in Scotland.
Yeah, it's so important. What happens in England really defines what's going to happen in the rest of the world. The United States is too busy dealing with pandemonium, with the orange monster. So they're just no one can focus on this and won't be able to for quite a few years. So now's the time to set everything up, get everything sorted out in the UK so that there's a template. And then you can take that to Canada, where I am, and say, look what they did. They fixed this. Get off your butt, Canada. Fix what the mess you made and stop making it messier. Yeah, it's so important. But it's amazing how it has turned around, because all the money was at Stonewall's, it was going to Stonewall, was going to these activists who were pushing for all of this. And I think there's an element of transphobia in that a lot of people were just like breezing it aside. Like, yeah, gay rights 2.0. I don't want to be on the wrong side of that again. All these people who have their guilt and shame over not being on board soon enough with gay marriage and with, equalizing the age of consent laws and all of that stuff. This is their chance to say, okay, this time I want to get it on the ground floor. And they didn't pay attention to the details of this issue and the ramifications and how it has an impact on women and girls and how it's an impact on gays and lesbians as well. So this sort of grassroots movement online of us speaking up and shouting, even though so much money was being thrown at people to shut us down. It's very exciting. Things have changed. It's very exciting that, I think, the LGB Alliance and organizations like that and Women's Place UK are starting to be really recognized by the government for their role in transgender trend, is making a dent in children's school materials. Yeah, it's really turning around, and it's really exciting, isn't it? Because we've got a lot of forces against us. And the force that is with us is that once people hear what we have to say, it makes sense, and it's actually quite reasonable, Yeah. It's just a matter of getting people to stop and care, about trans rights, care about trans people, and look at what trans is and really try to understand it. That's what I think.
But if this is gay rights 2.0, we need to make it gay rights 2.0. Gay rights was all about people's rights to do things. Your right to marry somebody, the right to marry somebody of the same sex, the right to hold the hand of somebody of the same sex in the street and not get bricks thrown at you. But those are rights to do things, and they're universal rights. Anybody can marry, in Canada and in the UK. You don't need to be gay to marry somebody of the same sex. Everybody
That's exactly
has
what I've
rights.
always said. It's a right that anybody can marry someone. It's just the only people who take it. Yeah.
Yeah. These are universal rights.
Yeah.
And that's how we should be seen for trans rights. So for trans rights, they're not reserved for people with this, as I said, this mythical gender identity. They're there for everybody. So everybody should have the right to present themselves in society in a way which is more typical of the opposite sex. We shouldn't need to be trans to do this. We shouldn't need to be claiming to be trans in order to, if a man wants to wear a dress at work, he should be able to wear a dress at work. Rather than claiming to have a female gender identity in order to do so. That's what's restrictive. So let's campaign for the right of people to do things, and take it forwards from there, and pick out these as universal rights that we can all benefit from if we want to take them up on them. But as I say, like most people in society would probably not want to marry somebody of their own sex. Most men are probably not going to want to marry a dress, but want to wear a dress. But
exactly.
But the principle is that these are universal rights which are open to everybody, not rights which are restricted to some special class of people.
But they are restricted to sex, because some rights are restricted by sex. Just to clarify, sex is important. There are important places where, males should not be permitted under any circumstances, I believe. So these universal rights do not override the fact that there are special rights for females separate from males, because that's very important. Yeah.
Well, sex is materiality, and
there's a material distinction between a man and a woman. You can't make a material distinction between a man and a trans woman. You just can't do that. Laws for trans women, everyone's picturing in their head, a very genuine, very sympathetic trans woman taking advantage of these laws, but the actual law can't distinguish between a very genuine, sympathetic trans woman and me. There's nothing.
There isn't. I asked the question of another trans activist recently, and I said, well, what is the difference between a man and a trans woman? Is it gender surgery? Is it hormones? Is it clothes? Is it feelings? Or is there no difference? And then you just end up listening to just word salad, because however they answer the question, they're going to end up, it's. And I said, well, I'll go first. There is no difference. It's 5. There is no difference. And at that point, I'm quite happy to move forward. I'm happy that my answer is coherent. The moment people say, well, it's feelings, then you say, well, which feelings? And however activists decide, is it surgery, is it hormones, is it clothes, or is it feelings? They're gonna upset somebody by saying, well, I just don't think there is a difference. I think
and that's why they want to get rid of any gatekeeping at all. It's just like self-ID. We can't figure out this puzzle to distinguish the material distinction between a man and a trans woman. So we'll just throw the puzzle away and say, anyone declares at any time, everything will be fine. I remember I was watching a video. It was some state legislature. I think it was Maine. I forget. But it was a bunch of activists, enthusiastic activists, who were trying to pass this law that was like a self-ID law for the state, essentially. And, it's like in a city council or a state council or whatever. And the guy, one of the guys on the panel who was listening to it, there was like a group of feminists who were arguing against the law and a group of activists who were arguing for it. And one of the men on the panel was like, okay, how do you materially distinguish between a man and a trans woman? Who is to say that if there was like a grant that was going to be offered to women only, why couldn't I just declare that I'm a woman to get it? And the activist would be like, well, trans women are women, that's why. And he'd be like, that's not answering my question. And he'd go further and further and be like, he's saying like, listen, this isn't about I hate trans people and you love trans people. This is about good legislation and bad legislation. Everyone in this room affirms the right for trans people to have dignity and protections in society. But I can't figure out how this legislation is going to apply to trans women and not apply to me. And therefore, this is bad legislation. And they just didn't get it. They were just like, you're a transphobe. And it's like,
yeah, you're a transphobe. And other legislators, in Massachusetts, they've done it. Why can't we do the same? And it's appealing to because somebody else has made a mess of their legislation doesn't mean to say it's a good idea for you to do it too.
Right. But we haven't even gotten into all the metaphysics around people claiming to be literally female and that sex doesn't exist or that sex is a spectrum. All of that mess that seems to dominate so many of the Twitter disputes and arguments. So many people seem to be, again, they can't solve the riddle of distinguishing a man from a trans woman in a material way. So they try to circumvent the issue by saying, well, sex is a spectrum. There's no such thing as male and female to begin with.
Yeah. And then they co-opt intersex people who think, hey, why are we getting called into this? Which is deeply wrong and deeply concerning, because we then deny the sex of intersex people, because to try and justify the fact that sex is some sort of spectrum, which is total nonsense. Our bodies are either virilized or they're not. Then intersex people get brought in, and it's rude and unkind to say to intersex people, well, you're not properly male or not properly female, where they are. They just happen to have differences of sexual development within their biological sex. And but it just obscures the issue, doesn't it? When we say that sex is a spectrum, and you say, well, no, it isn't. And if you're not sure, go and ask your biological parents, both of them.
But if you would grant, even if you say, okay, fine, I will concede sex is a spectrum, you still have to connect that to the phenomenon of transgenderism. A person who was perfectly functioning anatomically male, who fathers 3 children, suddenly transitions. At what point? How are they on that spectrum? They've fathered children. They're clearly functionally male biologically. Yeah. So you still have to connect this idea that sex is a spectrum to the goal, which is to try to say that someone who is trans is somewhere on that spectrum, and they don't. You know what I mean? They don't do that. So just this is like
doesn't
make any sense.
Males can't become female. There is nothing you can do to turn a male into a female.
Well, if there
Uh,
was, there'd be a hell of a Nobel Prize, right? Like
yeah,
people act like we just assume it's possible, and just the Nobels just
it,
ignored
it,
this magical discovery.
yeah, it doesn't work. And this idea that there is a new biology which is more complicated than the biology we learnt at school is deeply disingenuous. It's there is nothing new. There are two sexes, and we all know this. We've always known it. We still know it, and I'm convinced that most of the activists who are trying to delude themselves also know it, which is explains why they get so cross when you challenge them on it.
Exactly. It's all performance. I think deep down they know it's not true. They protest too much.
Yes,
So how what do you think is next for this movement? What do you think the next big challenges are going to be?
children.
Yeah.
There's three aspects. There's three aspects in my campaigning. One has been basic trans rights, the right for medical treatment, looking at how the law's applied. In the UK, we're pretty secure actually. The idea that we lack rights it's nonsense. We have the same rights as everybody else plus more. There is a lack of funding in the health service, but it's not just in transgender medicine. That's a genuine campaign which will be ongoing for appropriate funding of healthcare. Women's rights are at risk, but with the announcement which is coming next week and was trailed in the press over the weekend, uh, we can that is crucial to say that women that people can't define their own legal sex is major to actually turn that over. But my biggest concern is children. Women. Trans rights are secure. Women's rights, they've lost some, but those can be recovered. But children only live once, and children who got put on medicalized pathways before puberty, those children can't easily reverse that. And children are entering adulthood now without first clue on how they're going to fit into this, and have been told by adults that everybody will accept them as the opposite sex, and all will be well. And promises have been made to them, which the adults making those promises can't deliver, which is shameful. But that I think is the next is the next big issue. There are two court cases in the UK which have been brought against and they both involve paediatric transition and medicalisation of children, and those will be huge. The medical authorities, the medical protocols in the UK changed from watchful waiting to try and work with children who are struggling with their gender, through to affirmation, and that I think is the biggest issue, and it's the one which, with the court cases going through, will be the focus as we move into the end of this year and the next. I think, might be wrong, as I said before, you're never sure what's going to happen next.
Yeah.
Anything can happen in this debate.
Yeah, I think we both agree that affirmation is terrible as a for children. It's just assuming that any kid with any distress around their body that's related to gender in any way, or sex rather, is like you just automatically put them on a medical pathway. It's appalling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or tell them that the medical pathway is available and then withhold it from them. So that's a form of medical torture. It's a form of mental torture, is that?
It's a very, very, very good point. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. There's something I wanted to talk about. You're mentioning that trans people have their rights more or less in the UK, and then some, and they're okay. But I definitely, a lot of people in the UK who are trans talk a lot about feeling very vulnerable. Vulnerability is something that gets expressed very loudly by trans people very often. And I was chatting with Graham Linehan in our weekly podcast last week, and I wanted to distinguish between the idea of feeling fragile and the idea of being vulnerable to external attacks or external And I wondered if do you know what I mean? What do
Yeah.
you think the state of that is for people in the United Kingdom who are trans men and trans women? Are there incidents of attacks? Are people being harmed? Are they relatively okay in relation to, say, females? Yeah.
There are abusive people around who will attack people for being different, and we do need to look after people. Sorry, I don't think I don't perceive trans people to have it particularly bad.
Yeah.
Women suffer at the hands of abusers. Trans people suffer at the hands of abusers. Racial minorities suffer at the hands of abusers. These abusers often are the same people who will abuse because of them rather than the people they're abusing. I don't see the UK to be a transphobic society. I have a public facing role. I'm a teacher. I go to work every day on public transport. I come home again. The amount of abuse I get is it's minimal. Now, I'm not looking, but I'm never looking for validation from other people for who I am. The validation that matters is from myself. I accept myself. I know who I am. I know I'm not a woman. I do my best to, I do my best to pass myself off in society in the same way as a woman. Sometimes I get clocked. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I pass unnoticed. I really don't care. But I'm never ever looking for the validation of other people. And that's where others, I think, are looking for that, in that they need other people to affirm them as the opposite sex. And if that affirmation is not coming, then it affects their own self-perception of self and makes them and builds internal anxieties. And that's where it's coming from, which again is being driven by this gender identity ideology. It's not doing trans people any good, isn't this?
No, it's not.
If as trans people we were encouraged to think that yes, Debbie, you're a male person, and we'll not call you a man. It's a bit unkind to call you a man, but you're a male person who prefers to express yourself in the same way as a female. But everybody's happy with that. There is no way of denying that. But we're telling people they're really the opposite sex, and they know that the rest of society doesn't think it, and then they get anxious because their identity as they perceive it is then not being validated by other people, and it's no wonder. It's no wonder people feel anxious. Their mental health suffers, and they don't live lives they don't appear to be satisfied with their lives. It's appalling. It really is.
It's like social dysphoria. You've got your gender body dysphoria, and you're just transferring it onto society. It's everyone else's fault because they're not acknowledging me as the sex I truly believe I am, or something. Yeah. It's just transferring it. Yeah. I mean, you're a high school teacher, so I mean, teens are a tough crowd, and if it seems like they're fine with you. You're not getting problems. Is that right? No. How is it just a moment of levity? I mean, in Canada, we address a teacher as like Mr. or Miss or Mrs. Are you a Miss or a Mrs.? How does it work?
I'm a doctor.
Oh, you're a doctor. Oh, that's right. So you've avoided the question altogether.
Oh yeah, that was. I remember going to because I transitioned in other aspects, but work we did over Christmas, so it was right at the end of the end of term in 2012. I went back on about the 3rd of January in 2013 and wandered in and said, "You've noticed that some things are different." Some things are different, I said, but I may look a bit different, I may sound a bit different. I probably won't sound a bit different, but I said, but homework still needs to be done, and Dr. Hayton is still Dr. Hayton. Let's move on with the course. And that was I guess a bit of privilege that I had, but acquiring a gender neutral title was not the reason I did a PhD. I did a PhD because I enjoyed physics, but there were times, I tell you, during the writing up when the writing up bit was becoming grim and difficult, and the thought of acquiring the thought of dumping a title Mr. and acquiring a gender neutral title was very alluring, and that
Wow.
was 20 years before I transitioned, and I had the issues then. So for me, not much changed, and I can fudge that issue. Yes, it's Dr. Hayton. But life just went on. Children have their own issues to talk about, and which concern them, and their private lives of their teachers is perhaps perhaps something for speculation, but it's not something which they necessarily engage their teachers about, and it's certainly something which comes into the classroom where we're there to do work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, this has been such an exciting chat. We really covered a lot. We've covered some of the recent developments. We've covered, what haven't we covered? Have we missed anything?
I don't think so. We've been through a pretty short. We've not mentioned J.K. Rowling.
Oh, we have not mentioned Rowling, and most importantly, how to pronounce Rowling.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I don't either. I'm Rowling, but I'm getting corrected.
Yes.
But yeah, what a hero she's been, don't you think?
Yeah.
Have you ever spoken to her?
I've never spoken to her.
Oh.
I've written a number of pieces about her when different publishers were coming wanting something to be written. I'm thinking, can I write and I have another one. I have one in production at the moment. I think she has she's become a lightning rod for so much abuse and misogyny, and she knew what she was getting into. She'd clearly researched it.
This is her charitable contribution. Like, I can take this because I have all of this money and power, so I'm going to use that money and power and sacrifice some of it for this cause. Don't you think?
Yeah, but she has said nothing that's transphobic, nothing which is hateful, nothing which is inclusionary to trans people, and the abuse that she has suffered for this is just absolutely appalling. And it's, again, it comes down to not what she's done or what she's said, but it's a modern day. It's like a modern day witch hunt. Mm-hmm. J.K. Rowling is a TERF. Therefore, everything J.K. Rowling says is TERF speak, and it's just appalling. And we need to call this out, and as many people as possible need to call it out, because it's tempting for the stark onlooker to think, well, if people are so upset with J.K. Rowling, then there must be something in this. Well, no, there isn't anything in it. It's a big lie, and we tell big lies, and big lies are more likely to be believed because why else would you be saying this if it wasn't the truth? But it's not the truth.
But we're in such a dangerous position right now because it's not the truth, but it's so hard to speak out against these lies. There are so few people speaking up, and it's already like the opposition has gained so much ground that it's already such a risk to one's personal safety and one's personal career and livelihood to speak out against the mob. I mean, it also can't last forever, right? Like, we're in a really critical position right now because there's this narrative going to take hold and become locked into society. I can't see that being possible because it's absurd. It's like saying that Scientology is going to replace biology. It
is absurd, but it's got such a grip on society.
How long is this grip going to last? Like, what's going to happen?
Well, you keep thinking, whenever something happens, you think this has got to be. We can't go on. We can't go. But something keeps happening. A billboard goes up in Vancouver saying, I love J.K. Rowling. And I'm thinking we had one in Edinburgh that went up. It lasted about 12 hours in Edinburgh.
Yeah, and
the board in Edinburgh got taken down, and there wasn't a single official complaint made.
That's right, not a single one.
Not a single complaint. It was simply the management just becoming anxious about what they saw on Twitter. Yeah. And how angry voices on Twitter drive policy. It's just bizarre. And yeah, I saw the
Yeah.
board go up. I saw the board go up in Vancouver. Well, not literally, but I thought the board goes up in Vancouver, and I thought I'd give it 24 hours. But it's just ludicrous. If that board had gone up, and they cost, they cost hundreds of dollars to put those boards up, if not thousands.
Oh, thousands, I'm sure. I don't know, but yeah.
And it's up for 2 weeks, and it's up for 2 weeks, then it gets covered over, and nobody would notice. It would be, the two people who put it up, perhaps put it on their Twitter and their Instagram, and everybody says, oh, good poster. But then, their opponents, my opponents, if they were sensible, would just ignore it.
Mm-hmm.
And let it pass. But no, we make a big song and a dance, and then the board gets taken down, and it's when it gets taken down, it then becomes mainstream media attention across the world.
That was the intention all along. They walked right into this trap.
Yeah,
it's not putting the billboard up; it's taking the billboard down. That's the news story.
Yeah. That's the story. We know one billboard in Vancouver is not a story, but taking it down is. And I hope that presumably that they that they should get their money back for this now, because they've paid for 2 weeks on this billboard. The company took their money. Now they've taken the billboard down. The least they can do is refund the money. So they've got all this publicity for free. It's just, well, I hope they do. I'm not sure what the terms of the contract are.
They got their money back.
They got their money back.
Yeah. I can't say more, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm
going according to plan.
I'm glad to hear it. It's just totally bizarre. It's you walk around the street where you putting those posters up. If they were ignored, it's not a story, but it's when it provokes this irrational outrage, and then everybody thinks, well, what's going on here?
Exactly. Well, I'm looking forward to the future documentaries about all this, because I feel like this is such it's such an unusual, strange cul-de-sac we've gotten into with this strange gender identity ideology. But the genuine harm to children, I think, is going to be possibly the biggest medical scandal in modern medical history. Possibly. We don't know how it's going to play out, but it's really awful. Like all these rapid onset teens who are just being rushed into having, hysterectomies and double mastectomies and very, very powerful cancer drugs and cross-sex hormones. And it's just like, and same with these young gay boys and, who, transition might not be the best thing for them. It's really just...
It's horrific. And it will be a scandal because throughout this time, there are people who have been calling it out and consistently calling it out and being ignored.
Yeah, but for so many outsiders, they just see it as transphobia bad, trans people good. Anything is framed as positive towards trans is good, and anybody who's critical of anything like that is bad. I get this all the time from people I know personally. I have to be very cautious about what I say about my feelings about this, because it hasn't cracked open yet. People aren't really looking in detail about this, but everyone who does almost invariably falls on the side of us. All it takes is getting people's attention and getting them to look reasonably at what's going on, which is, I think, exactly what happened with the self-ID movement in the United Kingdom. All the legislature had to do was actually listen. They got screamed and yelled at by women who were saying, you're ignoring us. And then they finally listened, even though millions of pounds were spent trying to shut these women up. And they were like, God, this is ironclad and totally reasonable and common sense. And, so we're not going ahead with self-ID. And I hope conversion therapy comes next, that any attempt to ban trans conversion therapy is shuttered as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out over the next few weeks. My political opponents on this are furious, and there's a lot of noise being made. But we'll need to see where it goes. I don't think it's over. It's not over by a long way. And we are, a change in government could ignite all this again.
Yeah, and we're all watching in Canada because we're next in line, right? We've got our own legislation that's already passed that we have to claw back, and there's more legislation coming down the pipeline that Canadians really have to rally to oppose.
Yeah. It's hard. It's always harder to claw it back than once it's gone through.
Yeah, but it's much easier when you can point to the United Kingdom, our motherland. We still have the Queen on our money. Canada very much feels very, like the child of the United Kingdom. So it helps a
Yeah.
lot to be able to say, look what Mom did.
My wife's family live on Vancouver Island.
Oh,
In fact, my wife is she has Canadian nationality, and it's whenever we drive across that border from the US, when you're allowed to, it does, yeah. Canada never feels foreign to us in the same way that the US feels different, should we say?
Oh, that's lovely. I'm so glad you've been to Canada and you're familiar with my
Oh, I love Canada. My idea of heaven is 7 a.m. on a BC provincial campground, making coffee on the campground with the sun coming up, with the kids still asleep in their tents. I've been there, and I think that this is just about perfection in life.
Well, my idea of heaven is like a perfect pint at a pub in a small town in England. So
Right.
I'm an Anglophile, so I like dream of moving to England all day long. So, or Scotland, but yeah. Well, why don't we call it there? We've had a long, good chat. This has been wonderful. I think a lot of people who watch this are going to be people who are very familiar with us both, especially you. But I'm hoping some people who watch this are people who are new to all of this and are hearing a fantastic, refreshing voice, a trans woman who's very courageous and speaks common sense, and and it's maybe helping people to see the broader perspective of this issue and the series of issues.
Well, thank you for inviting me on. I do appreciate it.
Oh, it's a tremendous honor. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and press the stop button now.